This episode is brought to you by the House of Chanel.
Join us for Chanel Connects, the Venice Biennale edition. We've taken up residence in Italy to introduce you to the artists, curators, thinkers, and makers behind the world's most important exhibition of contemporary art. Guests include actress Vicky Krieps.
I've been trying to push myself to a place where I let go.
Artist Julien Creuset.
My studio looked like a secret kitchen.
And renowned gallerist Sadie Coles.
The main thing is to keep your ears open.
Listen to Chanel Connects on Chanel.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
It was a real celebration of visual culture that's aligned with kind of girlhood in the Western world today. So pinks and dresses and romance and things like that. So she sort of reimagines them into abstract paintings.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by ArtNet News. When Madame du Barry, King Louis XV's last mistress, pleaded for, quote, just a little moment more before her execution in 1793 in the throes of the French Revolution, she seemed to capture the fleeting pleasures and indulgence of the Rococo age. My colleague, ArtNet editor Katie White, eloquently described this moment before du Barry's death in the opening of a recent essay, exploring how centuries later, the aesthetic of whimsy, romance, and unapologetic luxury has made a bold return. She calls it Neo-Rococo. So what is Neo-Rococo really? It's a contemporary movement, according to Katie, that merges the delicate pastels, ornamental elegance, and sensuality of 18th century Rococo with modernist abstraction and feminist perspectives of contemporary art. Artists like Flora Yukhnovich, Michaela Yearwood-Dan, and Francesca Di Matteo are key figures in this revival, and they draw on the decorative roots of Rococo while addressing the complexities of today's world. On this episode of The Art Angle, Katie joins me to discuss this fascinating resurgence of a centuries-old aesthetic sensibility and how it extends beyond the art world into broader pop culture. What lessons can we learn from this era of late Baroque art history? Well, quite a few, as it turns out, and there's some surprising ones. These artists are actually subverting the escapist art movement to draw out interesting questions about beauty and femininity. Hey, Katie, how's it going? I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today.
It's going well. I'm really excited to talk to you about Rococo, Neo-Rococo, Marie Antoinette.
For sure. You've been telling me about this story for months, rolling over it in your head, and I had the pleasure of editing it. So I've been somewhat with you on this journey. So I'm excited to dig into it. It is just a fascinating category of art that you've uncovered. We were talking ahead of this episode about how even before we get into the art world, that this Rococo aesthetic has been having a renaissance in recent years. So maybe we can start there and talk about it a bit. We'll get into the history of Rococo later, but briefly define Rococo, and we can talk about some of these pop culture moments that maybe triggered your piece in the first place.
Sure. So I really feel like Rococo is just in the air, and probably the most visible symbol of that is Marie Antoinette. And at Sotheby's, they sold a necklace associated with her for something like $4.8 million. And it was just some diamonds that she had maybe been affiliated with, not even like it was a necklace she wore. And that exceeded its high estimate. And that's like a follow-up to sales of her furniture and her jewelry back in 2018 when I worked at Sotheby's, where anything auctioned associated with her was going through the roof, hugely overestimate. And it's just sort of an enduring theme, like over the summer, during the Paris Olympic Games, during the opening ceremonies, there was like a cameo of Marie Antoinette, very kind of kitsch and fun. But for me, I think the trend goes all the way back to 2006, Sofia Coppola's film Marie Antoinette, starring Kirsten Dunst as the Queen and Jason Schwartzman as the Dauphin, who's Louis XVI. And it traces kind of the Queen's luxurious, gossipy days leading up to the French Revolution. So the French Revolution happens in like 1789, but really only in the last moments of the film is revolution even alluded to. And it was critically panned at the time. People thought it was really boring, kind of plotless, but I was a teenager when it came out and I really liked it. Like I liked that it was dreamy. I liked that it was boring. It had a really fun soundtrack that was sort of like The Cure, but then also Vivaldi, which was really new then. Like I feel like every sort of period drama does that now, but that was new and felt new to me. And it also felt very like adolescent, especially kind of post 9/11 USA. If you're a teenager, like there's war happening, but it's not really shaping your day-to-day life in any way.
Right.
So I felt like that was like a really good connection that she made over centuries, that there is this sort of weird connection between pre-revolution France and the USA kind of post 9/11. And I think it's still kind of fruitful. But beyond Sofia Coppola, beyond painting, it's like kind of everywhere in fashion right now. We were talking about this yesterday, but there's this whole like coquette fashion trend going on that's all about bows and ribbons and corsets.
That's a TikTok trend, right?
It's a TikTok trend, but it's like really lasting. You know, some of these trends are super short, they're micro trends, but this has been going on for, in some variation, years. Like an article you sent me about the Marie Antoinette curls, that was a couple of years ago. There was an article from BBC that was really recent. Oh, and that had a line that I loved that said, as if Gen Z and younger millennials have figured out how to wear Sofia Coppola films, which I thought was really accurate.
I love that.
I didn't mention this artist in my article, but I really associate her with kind of Neo-Rococo, Genevieve Figgis. So she paints these kind of beautiful but grotesque, like melting depictions of aristocratic pomp, I guess you could call it. And she did a collaboration with the designer Simone Rocha, who had her spring-summer collection debut this past fall. And so I thought that was kind of like an interesting moment of intersection between sort of fashion and the visual arts in this Neo-Rococo moment.
Right. So hyper-femininity is back. Y2K is back, and as part and parcel with that, Sofia Coppola's films are back. I was also looking up that she had like released a book called Archive in late 2023, which had like clippings and photos from these films. So I'm sure that helped the Gen Z researchers figure out how to wear Sofia Coppola films. But yeah, like as you said, it's bows and pastels and iridescence and sort of like voluptuous, like excess of fabrics. That tracks for me. I've been seeing a lot of that lately, but I guess we should go back to like the source of it, which is, as you said, pre-revolutionary France. What was the original catalyst for the Rococo movement, which was, you know, a painting, design, and fashion movement in pre-revolutionary France?
Yeah, so the Rococo, and I think we'll talk about this, is sort of the last gasp of the Baroque art movement. And it sort of occurs in the wake of the death of Louis XIV, Louis XIV, who was the Sun King, you know, built Versailles as his residence. When I was researching the Rococo for this article about the Neo-Rococo and artists who are kind of using this hyper-feminine language and frilly language, something I thought was really interesting is that the Rococo was also, as we're saying, film, music, all these things intersecting. It was also a cross-disciplinary movement. And so around the 1720s, it developed really in decorative art and then moved into architecture, then painting, but also poetry and music. And it's often traced to the redesign of some of Louis XIV's rooms at Versailles. So he died in 1715, and the 1720s is really like the kickoff of Rococo. And some of his rooms, chambers, were reimagined by Louis XV, and it was in this new style. So kind of a little etymology, but the word Rococo is from this word rocaille, which refers to these shell-covered grottos that were popular in France. So people would build these grottos on their properties, and it sort of harkens back to like ancient traditions. But I think the shell is a really great way to think about the Rococo. So it's like shimmering pearlescent, there's sinuous lines, it's undulating surfaces. It's really fluid and like ornamental and sort of purposeless in some senses. So that's kind of when it started.
Okay. I was also looking up Baroque also means oddly shaped pearl. So both of these movements, they start with this idea of like nature and idolizing nature and wanting to bring that in some way into these palatial spaces. But what is the difference exactly between the Baroque movement and the Rococo movement? Because I think the Baroque is a bit more immediately conjuring an image for people.
So traditionally in, you know, art history programs, Rococo is the last expression of Baroque art. So if you have kind of classical Renaissance and then Mannerism, which is sort of the last gasp of like the Renaissance humanism, Baroque art, which comes after that, the Rococo is the last kind of moment before a big shift in a style. So it comes before neoclassicism, and Baroque art started in Italy around 1600, and it's so Catholic, and it was developed that way intentionally. So like in reaction to the Protestant Reformation, which critiqued the church for corruption, indulgences, many, many things, as part of the Counter-Reformation to kind of stymie people leaving the church, the goal was to connect people to the church through the power of art. So Protestantism turned away in many ways from sort of image making as something maybe indulgent, and the church kind of leans into it. So instead of unearthly heavenly figures or strange art of kind of mannerism, which was off-putting to people, we get like very realistic fleshy figures. We get chiaroscuro, tenebrism, Caravaggio, Gentileschi, the Carracci brothers, Rubens. It's all about kind of transcendence through light, and it's very theatrical.
And dark. Their paintings are dark, right?
Yeah.
Like dark topics.
And it's extravagant. It's very over the top in the drama of it, right? So that is also in architecture and design as well. So we're getting golds, reds, simmering, sumptuous fabrics, very robust, strong kind of architecture. And then in France, the French Baroque, which existed kind of starting slightly after the Italian Baroque, Versailles is a Baroque masterpiece. So the golds, moldings, the huge mirrors, the upholstery, everything that's so big and so strong is sort of like the Baroque. And so after Louis XIV died, Louis XV, whose mistress was Madame Pompadour, who was a very prominent art collector, they had a kind of a more intimate approach to life and to society. They were not into these kind of like major theatrical events. So whereas Louis XIV had all the aristocrats living at Versailles with him, participating in all these elaborate customs, many aristocrats leave Versailles. They go back to Paris, which is where they had been before Louis XIV. And so they're transforming kind of smaller spaces, and also just the kind of functions of royalty became more intimate and private. And so where we had, gold, red, black, we get something that's linen and pink and pale blue. And so it's really like this shift away compositionally, but also thematically, way fewer religious scenes, much more emphasis on secular scenes, kind of romantic interactions, flirtations, pastoral scenes. So a much lighter touch.
Right. They kind of tried to do what the church did with Baroque for the nobility.
Yeah.
But then bringing in themes that would probably not fly in the church, like heavily romantic images. Maybe we can talk about some of the most famous ones. Like obviously, as you said earlier, like Marie Antoinette is this very enduring figure that we think of when we think of like the late Baroque movement. There's that famous portrait of her by Elizabeth Louise Vigée, and she's got this voluptuous hairdo and she's holding this delicate pink rose against this natural background. It's all very like cinematic, idyllic, and soft. But that's not even really the most famous painting. I guess the most famous one is, which is not a picture of Marie Antoinette, although they have a similar style. It's The Swing by Jean-Honoré Fragonard. And this is a very intimate, like romantic, there's like an adulterous scene happening here, right?
It's very saucy, yeah. So
not safe for church.
It's really not. It's a very kind of scandalizing painting. It is probably the most famous Rococo painting. I think if people know what the Rococo is, this is probably the first image that pops in to your mind. And the full title, even though it's really known as The Swing now, is The Happy Accidents of the Swing. And it was painted 1767 and 1768. And the scene, I imagine it's like a beautiful garden with tall green trees and foliage everywhere. And there's this rosy-cheeked young woman who's in this ruffly pink dress, and she's on a swing and she's pushed high up into the air, and her dress is billowing, and she kicks out her leg. And as she does, one of her pink satin slippers sails off her foot. It's very flirtatious. You'll see that there are like rose bushes all around her, and she's on this crimson kind of fancy seat. But if you look closer, kind of in the darkened areas of the painting, below her in the bushes is a man who's ostensibly her paramour, her lover, who's staring up at her with these sort of saucer-eyed adoration, and he's extending his hat in, thanks, I guess. And he's looking up her skirt. There's a garter that's visible, and it's a very coy painting. And then it adds another layer when you look then behind her in this darkened area where he's kind of obscured, and there's a man who's pushing these ropes that are swinging her higher. And that figure is kind of more mysterious. People think it might be a clergyman who's like taken her out, or maybe it's her husband. He doesn't know what's going on. And I think what's really fascinating about this painting is that it was like intended to be scandalous. So this Baron Louis-Guillaume Ballet Saint-Julien, he commissioned this painting from Fragonard after being turned down by other artists who were like, that is too scandalous, to paint a picture of his mistress and him looking up her skirt. So it's very, very saucy, but very flirty. And I think like Rococo, it's very flirty, funny style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll share it in the show notes, but you had a great column for your 3 Things column about this painting and all the details. Like, I didn't even realize that there was a third person, like the man pushing the swing.
Yeah.
Until I read your piece. Like, this painting really like emerges in layers. And something else that like emerges from it the more you look at it is that there's a fence at the back. And I think that this is maybe a good segue to like what comes after Rococo, which is like the revolution in France. Like, these are wealthy people. They're in gated spaces of beautiful nature, and they're very much living in a reality that is not the reality of the rest of France at this time. So we know how it ended for Marie Antoinette, but like, let's actually just get into that.
Yeah. So Marie Antoinette is executed at like 37 years old in 1793. So I think that is a credit to some of these Rococo artists, that there are subtle hints that this is a pretend environment. Like, they put in statues or gates or elements that let you know that this is not actually just a scene out in nature, that it's a composed space. And these images are very composed, right? This is not real life. So I think that there's kind of an awareness of that. But the French Revolution starts in 1789, and it was fueled by just massive debt by the French government. People were suffering from inflation. They couldn't buy things. And part of the reason that France was in so much financial trouble was because they were funding the US in the fight against England in the American Revolution. So it's like all tied together in this crazy way. Ultimately, it's the fall of the French monarchy. But what is very interesting to me is that people had a lot of anger, not just against the aristocracy, against the queen or things like that. They had anger against these artists. So we'll talk about Watteau later, but Jean-Antoine Watteau is sort of the first real Rococo painter, I guess. And his painting, the Embarcation to Cythera, they hid the painting because they thought that people were going to destroy this painting because it idolized sort of aristocratic frivolity. And then talking about like Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun, she had to flee France. She left France for Italy with her daughter in 1789, and I think dressed in disguise because she was so afraid that she would be killed.
Right.
And like, the funny thing about her portraits of Marie Antoinette, within the years that she was painting as a court painter, you see like this transition where there's paintings of her where one painting is Marie Antoinette in kind of like this muslin gown, very informal, and people were enraged that they thought this is not what a queen looks like. She's still like this Austrian girl who wants to like be on a farm. And then by the time she was painting her kind of as this sumptuous queen with her blue silk gown, the anger was that she was dressing so sumptuously and wasting everyone's money, even though she had fully embraced kind of the French style. So sort of like a figure of perpetual critique, and the artists along with them.
It's just so interesting when you paint this picture of a country going into massive debt, ignoring its local population, and then like funding campaigns abroad, and then a group of elites that are kind of like completely unchecked from like the coming consequences of these choices. Ben Davis, critic at ArtNet, like shared this quote from John Berger about Watteau, which I thought was really interesting, that like his work, the artificiality that's represented in it is partly a nostalgia for a past order and partly a premonition of the instability of the present and partly an unknown hope for the future. So it really, as you just said, like captures this kind of transitory state, almost trying to hold the present, but with the inevitability of knowing that it cannot hold, right? So maybe you could talk about this painting by Watteau a bit more, because he's such an important figure in the Rococo movement, however short-lived it was.
He's really one of my favorite painters too. And There's something just very moody about him. He was born in 1683, and he kind of revived the Baroque in a way that made it less severe and developed this Rococo style. So his painting Embarkation to Cythera, something people think it's an embarkation from Cythera, but that's another story. Shows like all these opulently dressed couples waiting to board this golden gondola. It's from 1717. So when it was debuted then, it was praised for a short period of time because it was made kind of in the immediate aftermath of the death of the Louis XIV. And people thought, okay, here's this like joyful, happy moment. And it's like the Ancien Regime is having this like moment of revival. But soon after, only a couple of years after, it kind of became the ultimate embodiment of like out of touch indulgence. But Watteau is like a very interesting artist because his scenes are always so ambiguous. Kind of the controversy is like, is it embarkation to Cythera or from Cythera? Because Cythera is like the island associated with Aphrodite, and there are all these kind of romantic statues that are like Cupid associated with Aphrodite, and you don't really know where you are. And I think that is a really key point. Like, there's been a lot of criticism of Watteau for not really having strong subject matter. Like in the neoclassical era, they wanted a message, right? They wanted to say, this is what this means. And he's very ambiguous. And I think scholars have like really tried to decode his work. But I think that ambiguity is sort of the point. Disorientation is the era of the Rococo, right? In architecture, it's undulating surfaces. It's kind of asymmetry. It's about not knowing where you are in time and space almost. And so I think that actually he's a very brilliant painter and kind of captures this sense of disorientation, haziness, strangeness.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so then like literally cut with the revolution in France. And that kind of spelled the end of this movement. What came after that? And you were talking also about some discoveries that happened around that time as well.
Yes, I did not have space to really touch on this in my article because it was already way too long. But what happened is Rococo was sort of winding down, kind of losing its vogue. But in the 1700s, while Pompeii had been known in some capacity since the like late 1500s, in the early 1700s, more ruins were discovered. And around 1750, 1748, there began like a real systematized excavation of Pompeii, which had not been enacted. And the funny thing is that like royals were plundering Pompeii, trying to get stuff. It's ridiculous. Like, oh, I want to steal this for my palace type of thing. And the style of kind of Pompeii with the painted walls, with these kind of delicate lines and sort of this return to classical mythology in a real sense, you know, like nude bodies and things like that. It totally like caught fire over the decades. And it's very funny because, you know, now with technology and everything like that, trends are so one-to-one. This happens and then the next day something sets off. But in those years, it took sometimes decades for things to really build up to a moment of full trend. And so that's like how this sort of style emerged. And also, I think coinciding with that, as the revolution is happening, the classical world had kind of more emphasis on like humanist decision making and ethics and things like that than you would think of the Rococo for sure. So it's just a style that was like more suited to the climate of the time.
Right. So moving to the 2020s, which we talked about a bit at the top, but getting into the art side of things, I think that the best place to start would be to talk about Flora Yukhnovich, who is a very famous painter. Now, we'll talk about her art market a little bit later, but what does her work look like and what is her origin story?
Yeah, so Flora Yukhnovich is a British artist. She was born in Norwich in the UK in 1990, and she's sort of the progenitor, or at least the most famous artist working in this Neo-Rococo style. So it's lush, pink, swirling floras that are really pulled, sometimes almost directly and reimagined from Rococo paintings. And they become these kind of like explosive floral scenes, whirling kind of. I think of Tiepolo sometimes, like there are these compositions that are kind of like moving in circular spaces at times. So she is joined with Hauser and Wirth in 2023. She's had shows at Victoria Miro. She's really like prime star artist showing with these really big galleries. And her Genesis story is really interesting to me because it's tied directly to Fragonard's The Swing at the Wallace Collection. So she was studying at City and Guilds of London Art School in 2016 and 2017. And she, at the time, was really influenced by like Frank Auerbach and Lucien Freud, these expressionist figurative painters. But she hadn't really hit something that felt like her own style. And so she tells a story of going to the Wallace Collection, which is where Fragonard's The Swing is on display in 2017, and having this like encounter that just sort of clicks into place for her, where she embraces this language of kind of unabashed femininity as a stand-in for her own experiences. I think even though these paintings were painted by men, it was a real celebration of visual culture that's aligned with kind of girlhood in the Western world today. So pinks and dresses and romance and things like that. So she sort of reimagines them into abstract paintings to use her own kind of style. But she also names many of her paintings after pop songs, which I think is really interesting and also kind of shows this cross the centuries conversation between contemporary girlhood or womanhood and this idea of the Rococo.
And she was born in 1990, so I presume she was also watching the Sofia Coppola film when she was a teenager.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think she's emerged at a very interesting time too, because figuration was kind of cooling off and these works are like post-figurative, but because they have such a strong reference, that you almost fill in the blanks of the abstraction with these figurative references, as you said, of the swing, for example. And so there's another sort of famous artist that you touch on in your piece, Michaela Yearwood-Dan. Her work is different from Flora's. Can you kind of explain the similarities and crossovers and differences?
So she's another UK artist, which is interesting. There's a lot of artists working in the UK who are kind of exploring this style. She was born in 1994, a little bit younger. She also shows with Hauser and Wirth now, which I think is interesting. That was just announced a couple of months ago. But she paints these monumental canvases kind of with abstracted, whirling landscapes. But in place of kind of these very soft pinks, maybe we get fuchsias, deep greens, blues. They're more saturated colors and they're kind of more rhythmic. So like maybe energetic marks, sometimes black, and quick applications in different places. And in some senses, in the kind of all over dynamism of the canvas, they remind me of Pollock. Like it's really this kind of all across the canvas gesturalism. For me, that reads as something more musical. And you touched on this, but Flora Yukhnovich's works I think of as more fleshy. So she's not painting figures, but she's engaging with like tones of skin, bodily weight, movement, and they're more plush. Like I really get like a tactile kind of sensation from her work. I think of like petals, like the feeling of a petal, like that kind of luxurious, velvety feeling is sort of what she's going for, I think. Yearwood-Dan kind of is a more cross-disciplinary artist as well. So she makes ceramic, she writes poetry that sometimes factor into her exhibitions. She incorporates musical soundtracks into her installations. So there are definitely differences, and there are similarities too, though. They have both kind of like abstracted these Rococo motifs and sometimes even like eschewing horizon lines. It's landscape, but you don't really know if you're higher or lower. Not all the time, but a lot of the time.
So there's that disorientation.
Yeah, there's that disorientation for sure. And I mean, they have reclaimed in different ways the language of the feminine. And I had this really great conversation with Michaela Yearwood-Dan. So she had originally said that she's kind of like caught off guard that people were associating her with this Neo-Rococo language because she thinks of herself as sort of like more in the lineage of like abstraction. But she's a queer Black woman, and she does think that using this visual language is very sumptuous is for like accessing a wider audience. So it's not something meant for the ultra wealthy. It's something that can be understood purely on its own merits of like visual pleasure, which I thought was super interesting. And I actually pulled a quote from our conversation that I thought was great, which she says, "Sometimes there's a sense of enjoyment from a painting that is so pure and childlike, yet we get older and move deeper into the rules and norms of society. We don't think that we can just enjoy something. We feel the need to interrogate why something feels good to us. If people don't have a certain education or access to language, their opinion isn't as valued as the opinion of someone who can over-intellectualize and make big conceptual statements. When it comes down to it, it might just be, I love these colors." So I thought that was very interesting because it's kind of turning that on its head a little bit, where the Rococo in its origin was really for the ultra wealthy. And in this case, she's saying this is sort of accessible visual language that people are familiar with and willing to embrace, even if they don't come from kind of like the art world, quote unquote.
Yeah. I so appreciate that like intention from an artist, actually. And I think it is like a really intelligent subversion of, yeah, as you said, some of the origins of the Rococo. But there obviously is a little bit of irony too, because both of these artists, as you said, are represented by Hauser and Wirth, as well as some other galleries. And they have incredibly powerful art markets right now and are largely circulating amongst private collectors. So things get bought and they go into private homes. We're not necessarily getting to see them all the time. Could you speak a bit about what's been happening with their respective art markets as of late?
Both of their art markets are doing super, super well. So Yukhnovich in 2022, her 2017 painting, You're Going to Make Me Blush, which is her abstract reworking of Fragonard's The Swing, sold at $2.5 million at Christie's London. She has, according to our ArtNet price database, like 100% sale through rate at auction, which is really wild, meaning every work by her that's ever come to auction has sold. And even though she hasn't had like really major works come to auction recently, in the past auction cycles, she had a few small kind of oil studies and they all exceeded auction prices. Michaela Yearwood-Dan, she had a few works come up to auction over the past months. And in both cases, her works are selling for, $170,000, not at the height of $2 million and above, but they're also kind of exceeding auction expectations. So there's definitely a market for these artists. And, we'll see if that endures. But for Flora Yukhnovich, it seems that she has a very strong collector base.
As we were talking about earlier, like the aristocrats were buying these paintings subconsciously or not, adorning their lives with a certain denial of the realities that were happening outside. Do you see some kind of parallels with these artists and the way they're being collected?
I mean, I really am of two minds with this because these artists do know what they're doing. Like they are kind of consciously engaging this language in a way that is self-aware, but undeniably, obviously, looking at a painting of lush florals in a home gives visual pleasure, right? It is an escape from kind of the questioning and the barrage of the news cycle. So I do think that there is sort of a visual pleasure to be taken from that could be read as escapist. And it is maybe not challenging a worldview in a moment, but I don't necessarily think that that is the function of art, to be honest, which maybe is not everyone's opinion. And I also think that there is kind of like an undue scrutiny on artists working in this style that I think is valid. And I do think is because potentially it's a language of femininity, where I feel like people are very comfortable being critical of this as like non-challenging. But we look at like the wider landscape of the art world. I mean, we're selling a banana for $6.2 million. Like, I think the escapism of our time might not have the same face value as the language of escapism in like the 1700s. And maybe we just don't quite know what that looks like yet. I mean, I think that we've got people being killed in the street in New York City, and we're talking about people going to Miami. It's a very strange time for the art world. So I think that there is an escapist element to it, but I think it's self-aware. I don't know if the collectors who are buying it are embracing it in that way, but at least from the artistic origin, I think that there is an intelligence to it. In most cases, not all cases, I tried to pick artists who I think are working in a way that is like considered. There's definitely just a lot of puffy artwork out there that maybe is not engaging with any kind of critical thinking. It's an interesting point, but the thing that I think is also like, this is not the dominant language of the art world right now. It's sort of like a current that's happening separately or running through it. So I don't know if it's something we're going to look back on and be like, oh, that was like a sign of the times, more so than many of the other artworks that are at market right now.
Yeah, totally. And I would encourage everyone listening to like read your piece, because you talk a lot of other artists and, some artists that are working more in like design as well that touch on this. And I think that the strength of the Neo-Rococo, as you've termed it, is that it has a certain mutability and flexibility, and artists can borrow from it with many different kinds of intentions. And on the whole, like seeing feminine coded artworks, because we've been seeing the rise of textiles and, you know, like more domestic themes in art and not having that being read as like craft anymore. So maybe this is like a nice kind of takeaway from this whole thing, is that this is a flexible aesthetic that can be borrowed from for multiple purposes. It's not going to wane anytime soon, actually.
I don't think it's going to wane anytime soon, because it's sort of this something that's like propagating organically. It's not really like a group of artists who are necessarily working together, but it's obviously something that is fertile to artists around the world for reasons that I think probably have a lot to do with just our culture at the moment. So I don't think so. I mean, the auction prices don't seem to indicate that people are losing interest in it either. So
yeah. Well, this has been fascinating, Katie. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to see what trends you'll be spotting into 2025.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for talking to me about this. It's really fun.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.